And welcome to your friendly neighborhood atheist. And joining me is the man, myth, the legend, a person who is known for hosting the biggest debates in the arena, none other than James Kunz. James, how you doing?
Very good. Thrilled to be here.
Awesome. So, like me, you're a wrestling fan, so I like, putting a little spunk on everything. So I had to give you a bit of an intro.
That's nice of you. I appreciate that. And I am indeed, especially the Attitude Era. But there's still some cool stuff happening today.
We definitely can get into that. The Attitude Era is one of my favorite times.
Definitely.
But if you could, introduce yourself and tell the audience a little bit about you.
Yes. So I am a doctoral student in psychology, and I also teach. And so it's really, sometimes I'm a little bit behind, oftentimes in starting our streams on time, as well as pretty much everything. It's a challenge, but I love running Modern Day Debate, which is basically, you could say I started it for a number of reasons. One being first, that in academia, not all ideas are welcomed. Not all people are actually welcomed. And I can understand there are arguments for that. And that's one reason why our channel once in a while kind of has a little controversy around it. We do have some, controversial figures or topics sometimes. And I think not all in academia, to be fair, but some are not as open to those ideas or people. And so we want to be a radical, basically you could say radically tolerant and radical about diversity in terms of welcoming everybody, every belief, every lack of belief. And secondly, is that this is like long ago, but some channels in the past, and like I said, this is not all. So there are many channels that are very fair debate channels. They do a tremendous job, a way better job than we can do. But some channels in the past, because I've done debates myself in the past, some I had noticed that weren't always, in my opinion, fairly moderated. And so that's kind of like our key value, is that we ultimately, we admit that sometimes things go off the rails a little bit. I'm not going to deny that. But I think at times it's for the, well, yeah, so that's basically it in a nutshell before I go too much further. Thanks for asking.
Yeah. Now, when you say we, who is we?
So technically it is, in terms of kind of the person like running, broadly speaking, on a kind of broader level, me, but there are definitely people who are helping, even though they may not be considered like officially part of the channel. And so that basically, I would say it's really kind of the channel in a way is, it has a lot of spontaneity in that people just kind of come and go. Some stay, some have been here the whole time, and some kind of come and go in passing and kind of share ideas or introduce us to new people. And so I just want to be absolutely clear that the channel, and many of, I think, the most successful and fun parts of the channel are other people's ideas. Like, they really are, and they're other people's efforts. And ultimately the channel, the lifeblood for it, is the debaters. And so right. I have to say that it really is a community-owned channel. It's not my channel. It's not, and it's also, my goal is for it to be a fully nonpartisan channel, that I have not and will not ever turn this channel into like, hey, this is James getting on to do a monologue. I don't think there's anything wrong with that type of channel, but Modern Day Debate, because we had promised it, we're going to always keep that promise that it's always going to be debates. There's never going to be any sort of monologue from me or after shows from me blasting one side or something like that.
That's really smart. And that kind of goes into my next question, is how, like, I personally, find it easy to remain, at least while moderating, and I don't have your experience, to remain unbiased and try to be respectful of both sides. But I've seen other channels, well, they'll start taking sides in the debate and not necessarily treat someone who didn't treat them fairly. How do you do that?
That's, yeah, I think that, some channels do it well, and some channels it's like, you can tell that it's, I think that frankly, being involved in debate. So when I was in undergrad, when I was in college, it's about 10 years ago when I got involved in informal discussions and like debates with your buddies and stuff, or even strangers that just wanted to. At first, when I was around debate or disagreement, especially controversial types, I was radically different than I am now. I was kind of like put off by it. And I was kind of like, oh, these people are like rocking the boat. Why do they do that? Right. And after a while, you kind of get used to it. You become desensitized, and you kind of say, for me now, it's like, I just don't mind if someone says like, I think you're wrong about this, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, yeah, I mean, like, that's life. Like, people are going to do that. And
right.
It doesn't bother me. And I think it's probably a part of that 10 years or so of being involved in discussions or debates, and some of them formal in person, some of them online, is the experience, I think, is a big part of it.
And how specifically did modern day debates start? And, walk me through to how you got to where you're at now, because it seems you're constantly hosting debates on pretty much every topic. So how could you walk me through that?
Yeah. So to be fully the whole story is that at one time we had started building an audience as modern day hysteria. So this is like, that was our name back before we became a debate channel. And that was when I did have monologues on things that I disagreed on in academia, because being in academia for a long time, there are a lot of things that I've found that I disagreed with and would kind of vent my grievances about in YouTube. But after a while, we hosted a couple debates just for fun, because it was like, hey, let's mix it up. And they were really fun. And so we were like, you know what, this is like a really enjoyable thing, getting to meet new people, and the idea of kind of the efficiency of, I don't know if it always happens like this, but ideally the debaters are bringing the best they have in terms of their arguments. It's an efficient way to learn. I mean, they're going to bring their best arguments if they're smart. And so you're hearing the best that they've read. And so it's, in a way, it's kind of like you're having this vicarious learning. All of their time reading and studying, they boil it down to their best stuff. And you get to hear that in the debate. So I think that there's something really valuable in debates with that. Like, you could say it's more efficient learning. And then, so we changed our name into Modern Day Debate after we had some debates go well. And I think, it from there started with religious debates, apologetics, atheism, and still is our flagship topic. And then we started saying, hey, well, like, what else is out there that people would get a kick out of? And then we started venturing more into like science, like flat earth stuff, and then now more political stuff. And the door is pretty much wide open to anything now.
And that's where I think it's a great direction to go, is not limiting yourself to just one topic, but allowing you to cover, as much as possible and be as educational as possible. I think that's a really great idea. Have hosting these debates. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, you are a Christian, correct?
Correct.
Are non-denominational?
You could say Protestant. I don't have like a firm denomination per se within Protestantism, but Protestant.
Have listening and partaking in these debates moved the needle for you in any way on any topic that you can think of? And if so, how?
Great question. This is probably the most, I get this a lot. And I think that on certain arguments, for sure, there are certain like arguments or positions where I'm like, I've moved in different directions, but I think that it's kind of like randomness. Like, in a lot of things, there's all these different like factors that are influencing the eventual cumulative like outcome or push one way or another. Right. And so I would say that my positions like really remain the same. Part of that being, like I said, before going into this, like 10 years worth of like kind of obsessively listening to debates and things like that, like MP3s, just, so there are things that I still learn that are new to me. But so much of it I had already heard through debates from other people. So that is another reason why it probably hasn't moved as much as people think. And like I said, there are some arguments in both directions where I would say like, yeah, it's like I'm not as convinced of that argument for theism or atheism, classical atheism, as I used to be. And then I'm kind of like, oh, okay, maybe maybe that argument isn't as strong as I thought. But again, the tricky thing is, it's like, well, for how long? Because there have been arguments where I was like, for years, I thought it's a sound argument, it's a great argument, and then for years, like literally, 3 or 4 years, I thought, there's this one objection I've heard to it that still bothers me. I just don't think it's. And then all of a sudden, you hear a response to that objection, and then you kind of come back. And so, knowing that can happen again, I've kind of stayed in this kind of where I've been.
What about have any atheist arguments ever tested your faith in any way?
I think the toughest arguments that come from the atheist position, let's see. Okay, so I think obviously the problem of evil is like something that everybody should take seriously. Like that is a tough argument. I think that instead of like Mackey's more deductive problem of evil, I think that more contemporary versions from like Roe, more evidential type arguments from evil are more, they're a little bit more modest in their approach, because they're not trying to give a deductive argument that there is no God, but instead try to say, examples such as animal suffering seem to provide evidence that maybe we wouldn't use a deductive argument, but we would kind of take an inductive approach and say this makes theism less likely. I think like Roe he has a tough argument. I think that another one that Christianity per se, that this wouldn't have to do with, it wouldn't lead to atheism per se, because it could even be that you believe in a God of a different type. But if you have the idea of original sin, this is a challenge where there are answers to it. But for me personally, and that's another thing too, is with all these debates, I think a lot of times we forget that we think that there are reasons, but deep down, it's kind of like the reason that this argument kind of like pulls on me is probably more of an emotional one. Is nasty guy Steven Steen is here, but I think that the idea that you are created and that God knows where you might end up eventually, such as hell. That is a tough objection. I think that by the way, one thing that's funny and is another note of a tough argument that never comes up, but that in philosophy of religion circles, atheists and theists would say, like scholars in the realm of that study these arguments, the Trinity is a tough concept. It's a tough doctrine. Like it's not a very easy one to understand. That one isn't one that personally like bothers me as much, but I just want to mention it because it never comes up in all these debates. Like it rarely ever comes up, even though philosophers of religion think of it as like, whoa, that's a big challenge for Christians. So those are a few that I take seriously, at least.
So I typically save audience questions for the end. And if you do have any questions for James, tag me in the comments and I'll be happy to ask them. But I did want to get to this one because I was going to ask this. Do you ever feel inclined to jump in on a debate? Not that you would, but are there times where internally you're like, this isn't right. I got to get involved. I got to say something, but you just know you shouldn't.
I think that there is a challenge for me where I'm thinking to myself, I know of like a study or a paper or something, an idea that would be relevant here. And there was an example of a debate recently, and I'll just keep it broad. But it was Elaine Eklund. She has research, she's at Rice University, research on why the scientists of the ones who do become atheists, why? And she's like looked at that, really interesting stuff. And I wanted to bring that up because it was being discussed in the debate. And so it's usually more like points. There are sometimes that I'm like, oh, I know of a great paper that like totally fits this. But I don't bring it up, even though I do think it's like valuable. And I think it's like, they're usually like, if I consider bringing it up, it's usually something I'm like, oh, that's an interesting paper, but I don't. And the reason is because even though I have that urge, and I kind of feel a little bit like we're missing out on that, where it's like, oh, I can kind of bring value to the conversation. The radical, like the strong drive for equal treatment to both sides is like strongly internalized, and it moves me to kind of restrain myself and say, because I usually, like in that case, in that example, I knew whose side it was going to favor. And so I was like, I don't want to accidentally, it's kind of like it's like any competition. And I think that debate is a healthy competition. I don't think it's bad per se. I agree there are bad forms of it, but you want if you are trying to be more persuasive, you want it to be, if you're trying to become a good debater, because of you, not because of the help from the moderator, or like in a football game, because the refs happen to throw flags in a way that seemed to help your team a little bit, even if it was just coincidence. You want to kind of know that it's like really on you. And so I kind of feel like that's the job of the debater, to do that.
So do people reach out to you? Like, do you think the debates have helped change other people's minds?
Great question.
I find in a lot of scenarios, people, at least in debates, technically dig their heels into their side more. And yes, you learn, but have you ever had someone reach out to you and say, hey, I watched this and it changed where I stand entirely?
Great question. I don't think so. And now maybe it like has. I think that most emails, if I get feedback, if it's positive, it's usually that they feel like it's kind of a community and a place that they can just, especially with COVID, it's kind of like almost you can kind of get away from all the news or whatever it is and kind of relax. I don't think, I know that I've heard people say, like, I've really enjoyed this. I've learned a lot from these debates. I don't know if I've had anyone say that they've been persuaded, but I don't doubt that it has. I mean, it's true that many people come to these and they've already made up their mind. Like, I don't deny that, but all of them, like, I don't think that's the case with all of them. I think that there are a lot of people who have probably been swayed in either direction, depending on, again, I think something that's underestimated is the influence of our own temperament, even in terms of like like Jonathan Haidt is a researcher at NYU. He's a basically psychologist in the business department there. And he talks about how when it comes to ethics, the best research that he has, and he's like a leading figure in the field, he says it looks a lot like we go with our gut, then we look for arguments after the fact. And I think that we probably do that with more things than just ethics. I think that we do that with a lot of things, even if we tell ourselves that the arguments came first. And I can't say that for everything, but I think that going back to your question, that that's one influence there too on where people go. And so they might be kind of looking for it.
So you did say you're still in school, correct?
Correct.
Do you have a full-time job as well?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's on the books, it's part-time, although it is sometimes like so time-consuming that teaching is. So I'm a teaching fellow, so I teach general psych, and that's for mostly like first years. And I have taught I taught a leadership class this summer, but I generally teach general psych.
How do you find time? Because every time I look, you have another debate scheduled. And I mean, I have a full-time job, and I've found that the streaming has, for me, I've been putting in 40 to 50 hours a week on this, specifically when it comes to like booking guests for these weekly roundtables I host. How do you find time? And do you have a life outside of this?
There's not much left anymore, Ethan. I think that I've passed on a lot for the sake of the channel. I think that it's hard enough, my classmates, it's hard enough like to have a social life and work on the doctorate and stuff like that. And that for me was the same thing before the channel. And with the channel, I would say like, yeah, my social life is like very limited. I maybe like once a week I get together with friends. But I mean, otherwise I work pretty much every day, and it's usually like 10 to maybe 12 hours a day. I do like to work though. So I mean, for me, like it's fun and I am like happy with it. And I do probably think it'd probably be good for me to get a little bit more time, like in terms of social connection with people. But like I said, I like the work, so it's hard to do that and pull myself away.
Right? It's like when you enjoy doing this so much, why pull yourself away from it? Like this for me has been one of the best experiences of my life. So when people tell me to slow down, I'm like, why am I going to slow down? This is so much fun. And I mean, I get to talk to people like you all the time. I get to learn. Like that's pretty awesome. So
It really, yeah. I couldn't agree more. Yeah. And that's the thing too. I mean, you do have, I think that I want to like be careful in how I say is that there is something to an online, you know, you develop friendships and you meet new people and you build rapport that way. I do think it's true that it is like there are connections in person are deeper, and like there's empirical data to suggest that there is like the bonding feels deeper and probably brings more feelings of connection. So that's why I would say like I think we'd be wise to be careful to not spend too much time with it. But there is like a social component to it. And it's probably, I think as long as it doesn't make up too much of a proportion, that we still have those like in-person connections. Like it's a fun, yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's a fun thing to do and you meet new people and especially, yeah, exactly. You learn, you hear new ideas.
So question from Bestname. Do you have a favorite argument for theism? Like if you were going to give me one right now, what do you think is the most swaying argument that would move the needle for me? And then counter to that, do you have a least favorite where you're like, I really wish they would stop using this?
Yeah, I think that it's like contextual. I think for certain, it's definitely the case that when I've talked to people about this, like different theists at least have found different theist arguments more persuasive. So I'm not sure for you because I've only gotten to listen to your interview with Cy 10 Kate, which I did really enjoy. It was a great interview. It was honestly, I thought you did it really well, and I thought Cy was a pleasure to listen to. And so I don't know for sure for you. For me, I could say personally, there's like arguments you could say for like the ontology of like that there actually is a God, and then there's actually arguments for like whether or not it's rational to believe, like, and I mean, I have to be honest that I'm like I'm like big on decision theory, this idea that it's rational. So you can be an evidentialist, like I think a lot of people in the debate world are. Right. They would say you should only believe things based on the evidence. And I get that. At the same time, so evidentialist just meaning like that's the only criteria. Then there are also, loosely speaking, pragmatists. But you could also say in a more technical way, a lot of decision theorists would say, like, this is like decision theory is just the idea that rational creatures maximize their utility or their future outcomes. And it's an idea that's kind of one of the pillars in economics, and it's very prevalent in philosophy. And so the idea here is if there are decision theory based arguments, such as, and people always, they get wound up or they get triggered when I mention this because I don't think a lot of times people haven't seen the contemporary versions of Pascal's wager. They're so different from Pascal's wager. I don't know if you can call them Pascal's wager. There's something like it though, that it may be rational to believe, even if there were like a smidge of evidence, not for evidential reasons, but because it would maximize your utility, like your outcomes, and rational creatures maximize their outcomes. So that would be a reason to believe, even if it's not, and it's an argument to believe, but it's not per se an argument that it actually is the case. But now I still feel like my hands are tied by decision theory to where those arguments are like, so I have to be honest. I think it probably would be like those have this like powerful temperamental pull on me to where I think some sort of version of like a contemporary Pascal's wager argument would maybe be my favorite.
Could you, so I've never heard that before, contemporary Pascal's wager argument. Could you give me an example of one?
Yeah, so there are broadly speaking, there are two types. You might use one that kind of like more like Pascal's argument would say it's for your expected utility in the afterlife. And expected utility, just referring to like your expected desired outcome, is you could, like, some philosophers maybe say like your hedons, like the measurement of pleasure or happiness. It doesn't have to be like a shallow type of pleasure. It can be fulfillment or joy. And there are also, you could say, like, more psychologically rooted arguments that believing is rational, even if there's a smidge of evidence, because it might actually make you happier. It might make you whatever else there are arguments for it making you, psychologically speaking. And again, remember, a lot of people are like, oh, well, I don't care about like what makes me happy. Maybe like fairies and things like that. Maybe that would make me happy too. And we could talk about like that type of response or objection. But the idea here is, remember that people who, I think most people, if you dig down to like the axioms of decision theory, would actually say like, I agree with the axioms. And so you have to deal with decision theory. And decision theory would say like, yeah, like if a belief does increase your utility, it might actually be rational to believe it because you'd be better off with it.
See, I found like I try and stay away from the tooth fairy analogy, because I found that while to me, I do put them on the same level, you know, God, tooth fairy, Santa, like to me, they're all made up, but I don't necessarily like using that in an argument, because when someone else, let's say for you example, are coming in, you may find that incredibly disrespectful, that I am comparing something you worship, love, and believe to nothing more than this little fairy tale. So I don't know. I guess I get sometimes frustrated how quick people are to throw that out, because I think it can be at times insulting and doesn't help the person understand. Like I, for one, when I was a Christian and someone said that to me, I would immediately go in defense and be like, that's not the same thing at all. You can't compare God to this. So I don't know. I found that it's not always useful to use that in a discussion. How do you feel when someone does that? Does that bother you?
I personally don't mind. I wouldn't recommend. I mean, there are two things I'm thinking of. One is, for me to be my greatest me, I think is a me that is not offended, that just kind of like say what they want, you know, skeptics or critics or whoever it is, even other theists, like say what they want. And for me, like, go ahead, I don't care. The idea of not being like that, I don't care about those people or something like that, but more that I'm like, I have a firm belief in myself and my own beliefs and arguments,
right?
To where say whatever you like, I'm fine. And I think that that is something for us to all shoot for. And I think at the same time, like, I wouldn't recommend saying that on behalf of the atheists. Not because I think that, like, even because I really don't like I'm not really worried like, oh, you're going to hurt people's feelings or something like that. I appreciate it's considerate of you to think that and consider it and at least weigh it. I think it, you know, you should at least weigh it and consider it. But I think more so like it can look as if a person hasn't done their homework. Like in this case, like there are psychological studies that, like a lot of psychological studies that seem to suggest, like, not just correlational, but experimental, that religiosity, generally speaking, produces greater happiness. I don't see those studies for the tooth fairy belief creating more happiness. So, like, I kind of think of it, it seems a little bit like colloquial. I'm like, oh, this is like, this kind of seems like the village atheist type argument. And there are village type Christian arguments, so I'm not trying to be hard on anybody who says that. But I would be happy to answer your question regarding arguments that I think for theism that I don't think are good. I know you asked that before and I hadn't answered, but if you want to move to something else, that works too.
No, I would like you to answer that. I do have one question. When you say there are studies that tie in happiness to religiosity, is there a comparative study that shows, like, a secular humanist who focuses on belief in themselves? Like, do we have a way to compare to see which one contributes to happiness more? Or is
Yeah.
there really any way to do that?
Yeah, I mean, the best way, I mean, like experimentally speaking, it, would be to maybe have people think of their own belief system, like the beliefs of it, and the ones that would maybe give them meaning or happiness, and measure, like, does it increase happiness? Like for the Christian to think about their Christian beliefs and the secularist to think about their secular core beliefs. Does that like move them to feel happier? I don't know of any experimental data that's like experiments that have done that. I do know that you can look at experimentally, like seeing that religious type beliefs do boost happiness. The correlational data, you can't draw causation from it, but there are correlations. And like I said, this is only one piece of the puzzle. There are alternative explanations.
Right.
That there's a positive correlation with like religiosity and happiness. So that, I mean, secular being a non-religious case is associated with less happiness. Okay. But again, you can't say that's because of the secularism unless you do an actual experiment.
So this kind of prompted another thought in my head, when it comes to, believing because of happiness. So, for example, I found that becoming an atheist helped me come to terms with the loss of my brother. On the flip side, my mother, and I can never imagine what it's like for a mother to lose a child ever. But in many ways, she's made comments to me that basically says, like, I have one foot in the ground and I'm just waiting to see my son again. Now, she has 2 other children here, and yet her focus, based on her belief in God, is that she's now spending the rest of her life waiting to see her child. In your opinion, can't that be a dangerous mentality to have when you're giving up living for the here and now and taking a chance on something that may or may not be there in an afterlife?
So I think, just to be sure I understood it, I'll try to like mirror what you said, and you can let me know if I've got it right.
Sure.
I think you're saying, I think you put it clearly, but I just want to be sure, is that like, could it be maybe mentally unhealthy to be kind of committed to something that you know isn't necessarily true?
I guess, okay. Would it be mentally unhealthy to commit to something you don't know is there versus something you do know is here? Like, wouldn't that be an unhealthy way to live rather than enjoying the time that you have with your family and your children right now in favor of the afterlife?
Well, I think there are 2 things, just to try to peel it apart, just to be sure I get where you're coming from. I mean, one is maybe like a kind of to me, it seems a little bit like a bifurcation where there doesn't need to be one. That it is true that, like if a person were, if they had like their social support, their social connectedness was thwarted or undermined by their spiritual pursuit of the divine, that's like potentially possible. I don't think that, I mean, that's generally not the case. So let me clarify big picture first. There are definitely, like, I would concede, and this is in the literature, like there's empirical data, there are forms of religion. So when I say that religion is generally positive with more happiness, that's not all. Remember, that's just generally. There are definitely forms of religion that are associated with less happiness than average. It's just that there's small pockets relative to the broader trend. The broader trend is that, like, it's more happiness. There are small pockets that would bring less happiness. One being a disproportionate focus on a negative afterlife, such as hell. And so most people don't have that disproportionate focus on it, but some do. And, not surprisingly, it may make them less happy. in terms of like the time spent with people, generally religious people have like more social connections than non-religious. Like, so and that's actually part of the, like, it's one of the feeders or contributing factors for why they're happier. It's not the only factor, but it is one of them. So like, while it is possible they could become lopsided and no longer have that social connection, like it's like the opposite of what the data suggests, even though it's possible. Yeah.
And then jumping back to what would be some of your least favorite arguments for theism that you wish theists would stop using?
Well, one thing I just thought of is just kind of peeling apart that last question, just because I think so. It's there's like kind of the issue of if your religiosity leads to a reduction in things that are healthy, earthly things, then yeah, that potentially could. I think at the same time too, different people have different amounts that they need.
Mhm.
To where, and the other thing too is that religious beliefs oftentimes do bring about greater happiness. And so in terms of it being, there are like two different things. One, can our religious behaviors, such as prayer, thinking about the afterlife even, could that like be bad, that it might be less time spent with like loved ones on earth? Maybe. At the same time, like, you might also do those things with other people on earth, right? I mean, like a lot of times people pray together and things like that. But so it's like sometimes I see these like memes, they're like, oh, you're gonna, what's that? Like, I think they usually with the shootings, people say like, oh, you're gonna thoughts and prayers, everybody, like rather than taking action. And it's like, well, you could definitely do both. Like it's, and there isn't any data, despite people saying that. I don't know of any data that like religious people take action less. The data does suggest religious people give more to charity and volunteer more. So if anything, it's the opposite. But go ahead.
Couldn't that be though, because they've had, preferential, at least in America, preferential treatment? Like, for example, like easier to set up and get tax write-offs than secular organizations?
No, the reason is this is Arthur Brooks, is from Syracuse. He's a sociologist. And for one thing, he found that religious people, actually, the data seems to suggest that they give more to both religious and even secular causes than secular people.
Really? I need to see that. That's for sure. I'll take a look at that after this.
No, wait. One thing. These data, I think, are disheartening a lot of times. Like when I talk about this, it's not to say that secular people don't give.
Oh, I didn't take it like that at all.
Sometimes I think people trying to think that I'm like trying to like say that. And by the way, and it also doesn't mean that like the religious give more by a huge margin. Right. It's just that there's a correlation, and correlations, like if anybody talks about a correlation, it's good to ask them like what the strength of the correlation is, because most of them nowadays that they find are 0.1. Like they're not very strong. Rarely do you find something that's significantly more than that. So anyway, there are secular people that do great things. So I don't want to undermine those people.
And I could be entirely wrong. This could just be speculation on my side. I would think that, if you're correct and the religious community is giving more, it's because they're gathered more. They are, they have church, they have places they can go to work together. Secularism doesn't necessarily have that as much. We don't have a church where we can congregate and immediately, hey, let everyone know that this person is in need. So I'd be curious if we could find a way to actually put two groups in separate rooms and into a community and see which one gives more. I guess not that it really matters, because at the end of the day, we should all just be trying to give as much as possible.
I think it is good for us to all give as much as possible. I do think that it is true that religious institutions they're pretty good at having their enduring organizations or groups, communities. I'm not trying to be mean, but non-religiosity is correlated with being lower on personality trait agreeableness. So like that's why, that's probably one of the reasons why like atheist groups will sometimes like start but then fizzle out. Like on college campuses, that's pretty common.
Oh,
And
wow.
maybe partly because of the lack of a like just like trying to herd cats. Like I'm
Right.
not trying to be mean, but like is that like atheists are, I mean, I can say that out of all the people that asked to debate, I would say, I don't know, maybe 1 in 3, maybe even as little as 1 in 5 are religious people that reach out. Most of them, like 4 out of 5, at least 3 out of 5 are atheists looking for a debate. And it makes sense. Like debate is all about disagreement, and non-religious people, I think, are a little less agreeable. And so that might be one reason why they might not be in groups as often. Whether or not groups, and I'm not saying that's bad. Like it's actually, I think there are good things to being disagreeable. There are definitely pros with it, and there's definitely bad things with being too agreeable. But I think that whether or not like being in groups facilitates giving or sacrificing for like things independent of the group, I don't know. That I'd have to look at. Like maybe.
Yeah, I'd be curious. I totally just had something pop in my head and it flew right out. Oh, that's what I was gonna say. So regarding like atheists reaching out to you, I would agree. Like there are so many atheists right now that are like, hey, can you get me a debate? And I'm like, I'm having trouble finding theists to debate. I think, and I want to be careful because I don't want to like offend any of my atheist brethren here, but I find one of the mistakes I'm seeing that not all, but many of them make, they go in like trying to land haymakers every second they can. They'll go into full attack mode, be like, yeah, I pointed this out. I did this. You're wrong here. Cool. Did you change their mind? No, you just yelled at them for 5 minutes and it went over their head. And even if you're right, if that punch isn't actually connecting, if they're not understanding it, then in my opinion, you haven't actually achieved anything. I would rather sit here and take these slow jabs, play the long game, play 15 rounds, because in my opinion, James, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, from a psychological standpoint, if you and I build a bond, if you start to respect me as a person first, you are going to be more likely to listen to what I have to say versus me just coming on being a nobody and telling you you're wrong. Do you think that's accurate?
If you're trying to persuade the other person, I definitely think that, yes, the subtle, more personable, congenial approach would do better to persuade them. I think that there's data to suggest that. And Rodney Stark has like talked about one of the better predictors of a person's religion is what is the religion or lack thereof of their closest friends. Like their relationships seem to be a good predictor of what they'll eventually be. So if you start, so long story short, if they don't like you, like they're not going to be as likely to, if you turn them off right away because you come out swinging, they are probably less likely to be convinced in the long run. Yeah.
Right. And I'm forgetting the term. There is a specific term they use when you are being, like you are proved wrong. Identity cut. I don't remember what it's called. I'm going to have to look it up again. But it's specifically when you get proven wrong, you actually feel it as a personal attack. And even if you're seeing you're wrong, you're just closed up and you're not listening to what they have to say. Are you familiar with that?
I don't know the term, but it makes sense to me that without a doubt, if there's like you catch more flies with honey than vinegar is definitely true in my experience. And I think it's, like I said, there is data to suggest that's true. I don't know what the phenomena you're thinking of is called, but I wouldn't doubt it.
Yeah, it's going to drive me nuts until I remember the name, but K Christian, you're watching. You had asked me about what we wanted to break down. I had sent you a message, and this was one of the terms I used. Any chance you can put it in the comments? Question from Puck. How do you clearly distinguish between allowing a position to be represented in a debate and platforming that position?
I am open to their definitions. I generally have considered those synonymous, but if there's like nuances that make it such that I should consider those different, I am open to that. Like I don't have any like strong ties to the definitions. If I'm understanding right, are they asking, like I'm kind of wondering, like, are they asking like how I conceptually distinguish like platforming versus like having someone on to make their case? Or are they saying like, what are my thoughts on platforming? Or
So I guess I don't want to assume what he's asking, but I think I'm going to try and best represent it. For example, I had a video early on, like it was like my fourth video, where I was sitting down with an anti-vaxxer, and it really upset with some people because I was platforming a dangerous idea. How do we distinguish between having those conversations that need to happen versus actually platforming a dangerous idea? I hope that's what Puck's asking.
I think I understand maybe what you mean. Are you asking like when is it appropriate? Like, are there like when do we know like if it's okay to have a topic on to?
Yeah, like is there, I guess a line of something where you're like, you know what? There's no way I'm putting this on my channel because I find this to be dangerous.
Yeah, so this is like something that I'm open to changing my philosophy on. The only thing that we've had so far in terms of the philosophy is we don't want to have something that YouTube will kick us off for. And that sounds probably pretty self-serving because we don't want to cut off the branch that we are sitting on. So the idea is, because YouTube's it's our main platform by far. And if we get kicked off, we don't have any platform at all. So we do avoid the ones that YouTube would like bring the hammer on us for. Now you might say, but wait, like that sounds like a pretty like irresponsible like criteria.
That's reasonable. I apologize, please.
The reason that I would say we'd be willing to host anything else is because we're going to put a video out on this soon. There are a couple of reasons psychologically why I think it's actually, assuming you have like reasonable debaters, because you don't want to have somebody from a dangerous view on and not have someone that can give them a good run for their money, challenging their ideas, right? So I would say like there's an idea of like responsible platforming where I don't want to have an anti-vaxxer against somebody who's just going to get beat on. I think that if you have a strong, like a competent opponent, the reason that you can have peace and even not only have peace, but think that it's probably actually going to have a net good overall. There are a couple of reasons. One, we're going to put a video out soon on Steven Pinker so Harvard psychologist Steven Pinker talks about if you have these ideas and people, sorry about that. Let me, my camera sometimes does this to me. I'm going to switch to my other camera. Sure. 2 seconds. Is that if you have people who are exposed to radical ideas out there and they don't have, there we go, is that if they don't have refutations of these radical ideas they're exposed to, well, when they're exposed to them, they're probably like odds aren't that bad that they're going to, it's almost like an infection. And like if you're exposed to something for the first time and you've never been exposed to it before, in the same way that you might become exposed to the flu or COVID without ever having had a vaccine, you can succumb to it in a much more significant way than had you been exposed to it with, you could say, kind of a weakened version of it, is that it can kind of take you down this rabbit hole where you start thinking like, oh my gosh, like I'm finding I started as a flat earther and then I found out like the government is trying to deceive me and everything else. And so like you go down this rabbit hole and you start interpreting everything in this, which by the way, I mean, you probably noticed these conspiracy theorists rarely hold one conspiracy. They all tend to correlate. Yep. And so it's like, if you ask like, are there any conspiracy theories you don't believe in? I think partly why that is you often just have people go down this rabbit hole. They start interpreting everything that way. But if you have them exposed to it in a weakened version, and by that I mean like where they see some of the arguments rebutted from the other side, it's almost like an idea vaccine, to where when they're later exposed to it from, let's say they go to a podcast where it's just a a one-sided anti-vax position, they'll at least have been exposed to it in a rebutted form in these debates. The other thing is that this is from, I can't remember what year it was, but it's Cacioppo, Petty and Cacioppo, and their research on basically the modes of persuasion. So this is like a theory in psychology. So it's like theory, I mean that like in the scientific sense, it's like really well supported. There's a lot of data behind the idea that if you are persuaded by like facts and reasoning and like good, actual like rational thinking, that seems to be what's longer lasting. And so even if the anti-vaxxer is more charismatic or more, you know, they're charming, they're that kind of like snake oil salesman or saleswoman, like, is that we tend to find that the emotional kind of persuasion that comes along with that doesn't actually seem to last. It's actually the more rational type arguments that have the more enduring effects on our beliefs.
Thanks, Christian. Identity protective cognition. That was what I was looking for.
Super interesting.
Yeah, check it out. It's I was reading about it. It's really, really fascinating to me. And then question from Bestname. I can't get access to the study about charity. Does James know what method Arthur Brooks used and how large of sample sizes were?
Yes. So Arthur Brooks, I can't remember the book that he wrote about it in is Who Really Cares? Now, I think not long after, and this is something that if they wanted seriously, they could email me. There is an empirical paper that looked at it. And I think it was because they had found that basically they used the general social survey. That was like their primary data source. So it was like collected by somebody else, but then the researchers were like, hey, can we use this to examine it and run the statistical analyses? And that's where they had found it. The peer-reviewed paper, because the book by Arthur Brooks itself isn't peer-reviewed, but the peer-reviewed paper that if they'd like, I could give them the source for it or even just the PDF. But yes, so it was survey, given that it was the general social survey. But one thing I would say in defensive surveys, because a lot of times people want to just throw them out, and I'm like, don't do that. Like, is that, let me give you a couple of reasons why surveys are, despite their imperfections. Well, I don't want to go too far with this, but despite their imperfections, I'd say there are reasons to believe that surveys actually do give us valuable data. And I don't want to go too far on that because it might be more than they wanted.
All right. We only have a few minutes left, so there's two other things I wanted to touch base on. The second being my favorite, but the first one is, if you don't mind, where do you typically land politically? And if you're not comfortable saying that, we can pass that up.
Yeah, no, I'm okay with that. I feel like I'm kind of centrist, and they're politically, or I should say economically, I'm like pretty open-minded and like kind of fluctuating where I'm like, yeah, it's like, okay, I see that. And from like different sides. And I've always, even since I was when I was young, I always thought, I was like, what are the odds that one party would have gotten every issue right?
Exactly.
Because they're right. Is that there's not usually, I can't find one common theme that runs through all of the, reasoning for why liberal people take one position or conservative take another position. And so, I would say like I'm kind of, it's like a case by case basis, or it's like, well, like, let's look at like the data we have and go from there. I think that my temperament does admittedly lean more conservative. So, and I could be wrong about this. So correct me if I'm wrong. Like I'm open. I'm not wedded to the idea that this has to be a conservative philosophy, but I'm very much about the idea of, and I try not to do this for other people, but I do it for me. Because for other people, I'm like, I don't know their circumstances. I don't want to push a pull yourself up by your bootstraps type of mentality when I don't know everybody's conditions, because everybody is born into different circumstances. But for me personally, I try to be radical about saying I've got to pull myself up by my own bootstraps.
Same.
I have to take responsibility. Like I have to give like to charity. Like I don't like deferring that work to the government. For me, I'm like, well, I would rather, it's important to me to give to charity. Like, and there's an interesting, I think this, I'm trying to remember what book this is from. This is from Arthur Brooks too. But yeah, long story short, that some people might say like, hey, I don't see why this idea of like strong personal responsibility. So for me, I feel like my outcomes, what happens with my doctorate or my with modern day debate or my teaching, whatever it is, all of that is, I think, radically up to me. I'm not going to, no matter what it is that seems to, like slow me down in that process, I'm not going to let it, in my mind, I'm not going to give it the power of thinking that like it actually determines whether or not I'll have success in these things.
Mm.
Even if it is the case to some extent, I'm just like, no, it's all on me. If it does well or if it fails, like I have to do these things to like sacrifice to see these things do well. And if they don't do well, it's my fault. And I think that the reason I like that so much is it pushes you to actually take action. And in psychology, it's called like this internal locus of control. And we do see that people with an internal locus of control who think my outcomes are my responsibility,
Right.
they have way more success in life than people who say, oh, it's not really about me. Corporations nowadays, they practically like control my destiny, or the government or whatever else. And it's like, nope. Like I would highly recommend not believing in that, because we do see it's associated with a lot of negative outcomes.
Right. Okay. In 30 seconds or less, what is the craziest debate you've ever moderated?
Probably whether or not atheism is a hate cult, because Max Dean Esme, who we actually, Max, I've got no grudge, but we banned him since then. But Max wanted to debate this. He was a controversial fellow, and that was definitely, he wanted that debate. He's pretty tough on the atheist community, but that's one thing. Even though like, I really do hope atheists, the biggest thing for me is like, I hope that I can have a good relationship with atheist people, even though we don't agree on everything. Like, is that for me, it's like, why do we have to? Let's not let that stop us.
Awesome. And we only have like 2-3 minutes left. So real quick, jumping back to one of my favorite topics, wrestling and the Attitude Era. Now I find that, like, for instance, like I like having flashy flyers. I like building things up because to me, it makes it more exciting for the average person. Do you take any of that, what I call entertainment psychology, into what you do?
Absolutely. And the reason is that I think it's just, well, for one thing, like we do see like from different data sources, like people are visual, they are more visual on average. And so having a flashy, like something that's appealing to the eye, like thumbnails or channel art, whatever, does seem to draw people. Like, people are kind of like, oh, it looks nice. And pro wrestling, I think, does do a good job of that. I mean, it is a spectacle, and especially nowadays, it's gotten even more visually, like with the lights and everything and the fog machines or whatever. Like, they do a superb job with it. And so I absolutely do think that is a component. I think there are others, but that's just one. So yeah.
Have you ever had the opportunity to cut a promo on someone?
Do you mean cut a promo, like kind of like you're talking about what I think you're talking about, like the way that like The Rock would like talk about like an upcoming match?
Or like tried to amp it up a little bit and cut like a friendly promo, or have you ever done that? Because
yeah, I'm working on that. No joke. Like I am trying to communicate our vision in the most compelling way possible, and our vision is, we usually say, to give everybody a fair shot to make their case on an equal playing field. And the idea there is that's like it in a nutshell. But like as I communicated, I try to elaborate. And the idea is that if you communicate it in a compelling way, that makes a difference. If you're saying it with this enthusiasm and excitement and conviction, absolutely, it's a powerful factor.
Yes, I'm glad it's nice to meet someone else in this industry who understands that. I think it's important, and if we jazz things up a little bit, it's kind of like flashing like a big rainbow or flag to get people's attention. Like, check this out. Sorry, I know we have to wrap this up. Who is your favorite wrestler?
Probably The Rock. Although I just want to add to your last point, I couldn't agree more. I'm not trying to be hard on apologists, but I think the apologetics world, there are some like newcomers who are changing things up and making it like fresh and exciting and stuff like that. But the apologetics world, I think, has been plagued by boredom for a long time, to where I love I love reading these things, but I think that oftentimes apologists don't remember that like the average person they're not going to like sit around to read philosophy or listen to it for very long unless you make it somewhat juicy too.
Right. And that's literally like what I want to do. I want to make, because to the average user, religious conversations aren't exciting. I want to make them excited. I want them to go, wow, I want to hear this religious or political conversation. Anyways, to wrap it up, since we're over time, where can everyone check you out at?
We're at Modern Day Debate, and we really do. We want to welcome people from all walks of life. And so I couldn't say that with more sincerity, just because I really do feel like, if anything, we just hope like everybody from every walk of life, belief or lack of belief or demographic, that they really would get an equal kind of platform, make their case.
Well, if you could stay on line for just one moment, I do want to thank you for coming on. It was nice getting to know James, the man behind Modern Day Debate. And if you ever want someone to practice cutting a promo on, the invitation's there. I would love to go back and forth with you. It'd be a really good time.
That's funny.
Thank you to all my patrons: Cindy PLAZA, Trina Deluca, Kenneth Leonard, Christian Watkins, Kathy Letto, Ian Davenport, Bestname Ever, and Edith. Make sure you like and subscribe. And if you want to become a Patreon, the link is in the description, or you can buy us a cup of coffee. Thanks, everyone, and have a really good night.